Hi, everyone. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic.online. Go and visit it for high class educational materials in the humanities. Today, I am joined by Dr. Jonathan Cook. We have some of our most energizing and invigorating conversations with Dr. Cook. And we're going to be talking about, I suppose it would be an often overlooked piece of Melville's. He brought it to my attention, and it is battle pieces and aspects of the war. And ironically, I just now recalled that our whole relationship was started by because I came across a poem in this book that I didn't know that existed. I thought the poem was separate. I did a recording of the Scout Towards Aldi, and then I went online looking for resources, and then I found Dr. Cook was an expert on it. So that's how we got connected. So, would you like to say a little bit about this piece of Melville's before we get into some recitations and some analysis of the poems?
Yeah, well, I just want to say that we had a wonderful conversation about the Scout Towards Aldi, almost 2 years ago, I guess.
Yeah.
So that started us off because that took a whole session because it's a 25-page narrative poem. It's the longest poem in this collection, and it's in the second section of Battle Pieces. Battle Pieces is divided into two. It's got the poetry of the war in more or less chronological order, but then there's a section called um, uh, let's see, it's called Verses Inscriptive and Memorial. And those poems are devoted to sort of individual deaths and epitaphs, and they sort of pause and commemorate special um, places and moments and deaths. And they're mainly commemorating specific individuals or groups of individuals. But the first section, which is the 2/3 of the poems, are the chronological sequenced descriptions of various battles and important personalities and events.
There does seem to be one poem in there besides the Scout Towards Aldi that looks really intriguing. Is Lee in the Capitol? I mean, it's I don't know if it's as long, but it looks very long.
Yeah, not nearly as long, but it's one of the longer ones. Yeah. So anyway, Battle Pieces published in the summer of 1866. So Melville, you'd already had a year pass, and Melville claimed that he wrote the poems after the cessation of hostilities, but it's clear that he was doing some writing during the war. I think he wrote most of the Scout Towards Aldi in the last year of the war after he visited the front lines in Northern Virginia in April 1864. So, he spent the war, beginning of the war in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where he had moved in 1850. Then in 1863, in the fall, he moved to New York City. So he spent the last 2 years of the war in New York City. And that's where he wrote most of the battle pieces. He was, of course, like most of his writings, he was influenced by the Bible, Old and New Testaments. And you get quite a bit of Bible imagery distributed throughout the poems. You also have a lot of Miltonic influence. Paradise Lost, describing the war in heaven, was a model for the Civil War because Melville, like a lot of Northerners, thought of it as a battle of right and wrong. The Southerners were obviously in the wrong because they were defending a horrible institution, slavery, and they were like the rebel angels in Milton's Paradise Lost who would not concede to obeying the God of the Old Testament, and therefore rebelled. There was a war fought in heaven and led by Satan. He led the fallen angels down in hell, and then of course he got his revenge for his defeat by tempting Adam and Eve in the new created world of paradise. And of course Paradise Lost ends with Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden sorrowfully to pursue their way into their future life. So another influence on battle pieces is Shakespeare. Some of the history poems he drew on, and he also you could consider the whole cycle of most of the poems forming a kind of national description of a tragedy, right? The terror and pity that he mentions in his postscript to the battle pieces clearly indicates that he thought of the Civil War as a tragedy, and his cycle is sort of descriptive of a tragic series of events. So there are various other influences, but those are the major ones. His Harper Brothers printed the book. It was his first book of poems. It did not sell very well. It got some attention, but most of the reviews said that Melville was a bad poet. So he was very disappointed by the reception, because I think he was trying to regain his reputation after he'd been 10 years without any publications, and he was switching from prose to poetry here, and he wanted at least some acknowledgement that he was serving the Union cause by writing these poems and celebrating the victories and lamenting the defeats, and just as a patriotic duty, he hoped to get some acknowledgement, but he did not really gain much of a reputation from this collection. It's really only been getting attention in academia within the last, say, 25 years or 30 years. Of course, his poetry was revived, but there wasn't that. There's been much more interest in the Civil War poetry and appreciation of its profundities only in the last few decades. So, anyway, should we start off with our first poem?
Yeah, well, right before we get into it, I think what we should let everybody know is that we're not going to be covering all the poems today. We spoke briefly before we began our session that we're contemplating maybe doing this in installments. And what Dr. Cook and I have done is chosen a half dozen poems each, and we're going to alternate between reading those and providing some commentary and discussion. But I'm just curious before we jump into it, Dr. Cook, what made you choose the poems that you chose? And maybe if we could just share that real quick about what guided our selections. I find that interesting.
Some of these are poems I found most appealing because of their imagery. Some of it because of their use of biblical imagery, biblical references, biblical allusions. Some because of what they illuminate about the history of the Civil War. And mostly, well, important for me was the strength of the poetry, the beauty of the language, and the interesting use of poetic devices, metaphor, simile, allegorical aspects. So it's sort of a grab bag of criteria that guided me.
Yeah, I sort of have a synthesis of criteria as well. I actually forcibly went against my instinct of choosing the ones that I liked the most aesthetically, and chose the ones based on either geography, the ones I had, the places I had actually been. So two of the ones I'll be talking about today are Balls Bluff and Lookout Mountain. And then the other ones were to incentivize me to develop educational materials on them, specifically Stonewall Jackson, Antietam, and Gettysburg. So I had some personal connection to some of the sites, and then also some professional mile markers. I'd say that, but I was pretty happy with the result anyway. They're actually, it's not like my criteria excluded me from enjoying the beauty of the poem. So why don't we get into it and you read our first one?
Yeah. I just want to say that we're here in Loudoun County in Northern Virginia, so several of these poems are set in this area because of its importance in the Civil War. So I'll start out with The Portent, which is about John Brown. The Portents, 1859. Hanging from the beam, slowly swaying, such the law, gaunt the shadow on your green Shenandoah. The cut is on the crown, lo, John Brown, and the stab shall heal no more. Hidden in the cap is the anguish none can draw, so your future veils its face, Shenandoah. But the streaming beard is shown, weird John Brown, the meteor of the war. Okay, so we all remember that John Brown led the attempted slave uprising at Harper's Ferry in October 1859. He was immediately, well, he was arrested after he was caught. He was holed up in the engine house there at Harper's Ferry, and then was in jail for about a month, or over a month, in Charlestown, West Virginia. It was actually part of Virginia at that point. And then was executed in early December. So the poem is about Brown's execution and the ominous feeling that his death conveyed to people at the time, because the South now knew that someone had actually tried to, a white northerner had tried to come down to the South and inspire a slave rebellion. So, John Brown's execution was kind of the first step leading to secession, which only about a little over a year later, because in 1860 Lincoln was elected. South Carolina seceded at the beginning of 1861, and then the rest is history. So what I like about the poem is that the comparison of Brown to Christ on the cross was frequent among Northern intellectuals. Emerson, Thoreau both wrote about this, and Melville sort of uses some of that imagery in the poem. The cut is on the crown, right? He's like wearing a crown of thorns. He's cut up because during his arrest he was wounded several times, and he's only been in jail a few weeks when he's executed, so he's got some scars and serious wounds on his face and head. But the stabs shall heal no more. So the stabs of the soldiers arresting him, the Virginia National Guard, who were called out, their wounds are not going to heal, obviously, because this was the point when any kind of compromise between the North and South was impossible. So the second stanza, hidden in the cap is the anguish none can draw. So I like the imagery. When they hung people, they put a cap over his head so they wouldn't have to look at the horrible contortion of their features as they hung and turned blue and twisted around in agony. So is the agony none can draw. So impossible to express the agony of his face being hung and the agony of the country being drawn into war because of what his hanging meant. So the cap hiding the face is compared to the veil over the valley of the Shenandoah, which is where a lot of the war was fought, that corridor from north to south in Virginia, where many battles were fought, a very rich agricultural region which was laid waste because it was the corridor that the South used to travel north to, engage in northern Virginia and to invade Maryland and Pennsylvania. What I like about the poem too is at the end he talks about the streaming beard. But the streaming beard is shown, weird John Brown, the meteor of the war. So everyone knows John Brown had a long, gray beard, which went below his cap that he was wearing. So the meteor of the war. Well, the idea of a meteor or a comet, the word comet is from a Greek word for a hairball, basically. They thought of it. They didn't know what it was really, but these portents, meteors, comets. These, of course, have always been interpreted as foreshadowing major historical events. And there were, in fact, meteor showers just before his execution, and in 1860 it was known as the year of the meteors because there was a constant stream of meteor showers, and people connected it with the idea that the country was in a crisis, with the election of Lincoln and with the recession. So it's a good poem to kick off the collection because it's it describes the event that was immediately preceded the war before the election of Lincoln, and it really captures the historical moment well. The Christ imagery associated with Brown, and the idea of this horrible anticipation that people were feeling after his execution.
Yeah, you did a fantastic job breaking that down. I don't know if I'll be able to contest with with much of what you said or really offer as much. But I thought it was really great, and I think you offered a great insight here about the importance of cosmological events, atmospheric events, and what the role of those things, meteorological events, in the later in the poetry. The only question I had is the only thing I think that you didn't cover that struck me as sort of odd was his word choice of weird. Why do you think he called him weird, John Brown?
Weird. Well, weird is it's the Weird sisters in Macbeth. Weird is, as a word relates to supernaturally strange. Means strange, but in a supernatural sense. So
didn't the Weird sisters like predict the future? Couldn't they see the future or something?
Yeah, exactly. They were predicting Macbeth's future as a king, right? So yeah, that ties in with Macbeth. That's a Shakespearean allusion. And the other thing is that John Brown, when he was in prison, he corresponded a lot. He met journalists, would come and talk to him. He wrote letters. So. And as he was going to his execution, he made his famous statement that I now see that this problem of slavery will not be solved without the shedding of blood. So he predicted civil war as he went to his execution, and everyone sort of said, yeah, he's probably right. So you want to move on to Ball?
Yeah. I mean, we could just spend the entire time talking about the portent, but okay. All right. So this is the one that occurs here in Loudoun County. It's called Ball's Bluff. A Reverie, October 1861. One noonday at my window in the town, I saw a sight saddest that eyes can see. Young soldiers marching lustily unto the wars, with fifes and flags in mottoed pageantry, while all the porches, walks, and doors were rich with ladies cheering royally. They moved like Juny morning on the wave. Their hearts were fresh as clover in its prime. It was the breezy summertime. Life throbbed so strong. How should they dream that death in a rosy clime would come to thin their shining throng? Youth feels immortal like the gods sublime. Weeks passed, and at my window, leaving bed, by night I mused of easeful sleep bereft, on those brave boys, war, thy theft. Some marching feet found pause at last by cliff's Potomac cleft. Wakeful I mused, while in the street far footfalls died away till none were left. All right. So, I don't have the historical background that Dr. Cook does on all these things. So I had to do a little bit of research on, even though I did field trips there and things like that as a little boy, on the background of the Ball's Bluff battle. I suppose, just if I can try to give the shortest version of the events, and Dr. Cook, correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, but it wasn't really supposed to be a battle. At first, it was sort of a reconnaissance mission, right? And that McClellan was given a false report about some Confederate troops, and an initial sort of envoy was sent over by Brigadier General Charles Pomeroy Stone. Is that right?
Yeah,
And
some of your sound is breaking up a little bit. Is there any uh, issue about where
we
you?
have, well, we have the backup
So
here.
everything is
So
good.
it's just, yeah, everything's good, but it's just the internet. So just to recap what I just said there, it happened on October 21st, 1861 in Loudoun County, and the Union Army forces commanded by Major General George B. McClellan were defeated. And it started as a minor reconnaissance mission to determine if the Confederates were occupying Leesburg. And it was all predicated on a false report,
Yeah, I mean
right?
it was one of the early fiascos for the Union. Following, Manassas in July 1861. This was the fall, October 1861, and a bunch of, the Union sent a bunch of boats up the Potomac and excursion, and Ball's Bluff is a very steep incline, and they, there was thought that there was a Confederate army amassed there, and so they thought they had spied the army, but they actually saw a bunch of trees there. So
Right,
the
right,
problem was that they were fighting in a terrible position because they were right on the bluff, and they were, falling off and floating into the Potomac because they eventually went into retreat, and they couldn't bring enough soldiers over because they had to ferry them over by boat. So they were
right, right.
short of enough troops, and when they couldn't hold their line, they were uh, trying to escape in a very perilous place. So the Confederates were sort of picking them off as they were running down the slopes of the cliff towards the Potomac.
Right. And what's very interesting is the person that was trying to reinforce the Union troops as the Confederate troops amassed and started picking off the Union troops that made the initial raid was Colonel Edward Baker, which I suppose he was a U.S.
Yeah,
senator, I believe, and he was killed. He was
he was a
killed.
friend of Lincoln's. Yeah, and his
Yeah.
death actually led to an inquiry about why this catastrophe happened, and it was kind of a big headache because it was the beginning of trying to punish some of the leadership for botching the early strategic um, moves of the Union. But of course, the poem is based on someone like Melville, who was imagining what it feels like to see all these young soldiers go off to war, and then thinking about when they are killed at a battle like this. What a terrible thing it is to go from the celebration of their departure, all these young soldiers marching in their towns from the north, and then hearing about their defeat, especially when it's in a situation where they've been poorly led. I mean, that was one of the big complaints in the early stages of the war, that the leadership was flawed. The generals were not doing their job.
Right. And so there weren't, compared to what happened at Antietam and Gettysburg, there weren't a lot of individuals that were killed that day. I think there were only about 223 Federals killed, was given, the official reports. But it did lead to this joint committee on the conduct of the war. And I believe within Congress I believe within Congress at the time, some people were like, what gives with our leadership?
Um,
But
but one of the most other famous soldiers was Oliver Wendell Holmes. The son of the famous doctor and writer. The
right.
young Holmes, who went on to the Supreme Court later on, and he describes getting shot through the throat and thinking he was going to die in his memoirs later on.
Right. So something that I found pretty interesting as I've been putting together this primary source text on the Civil War is in all these battles and encounters, there's so little discussion of motive. You don't hear a lot from the soldiers and the generals a great deal about why they're doing the fighting that they're doing. And it's very perplexing to me. But something I do hear a lot about, and it's also exemplified in this poem, is the adoration that the young troops are getting from women. And whenever they're going through a countryside or something like that, there's this big jubilee put on, and there are all these women that are waving their handkerchiefs and sort of adoring them. And I'm just kind of curious how much of people's fighting at that time was based on being fawned over and being kind of rock stars amongst and getting all this female attention. Can you speak to that at all? I mean, Melville talks about it here in the close of the first stanza. While all the porches, walks, and doors were rich with ladies cheering royally. This seems to be a theme that I hear more about, this adoration from women, than I do about abolition or states' rights or anything like that from the battles and leaders of the Civil War. It's this obsession, sort of this female obsession with them. Am I reading something into that, or was that like a real motivating factor for why people killed their brothers?
Common. It was just to make them feel like they were committed to defending their families and their women and children. I mean, they were defending the honor of their family. They were trying to please women whom they might come back and marry. And it makes me think of the beginning of the Red Badge of Courage, when Henry Fleming the narrator describes his departure, because he goes through the town, and there's a famous description of a woman who's kind of looking at him as he goes by and isn't really looking at him, and then he's kind of looking at her and not really looking at her, describing his memories about how he got into his situation at the beginning of that book.
Yeah.
But one of the great themes of the poems of the battle pieces is the fact that these wars are fought by young men, teenagers. I mean, there are people of all ages, but it's sort of amazing to think that you had kids even in their mid-teens who were fighting their late teens, and it ties in with the idea that adolescents feel they are immortal. The idea that somehow they can't.
Right.
And the irony, of course, is that they can very well be killed, very easily in huge numbers during the Civil War. So, but it's a poignant theme for someone like Melville, who's has two young sons at this point. Of course, they were too young to fight in the war, but they were just a few years below suitable age. I mean, his son Malcolm was in his mid-teens, so he wasn't quite ready to fight. But Melville, of course, knew he had family members who were fighting. Notably, his cousin, through his mother's family, was in a New York regiment.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect summation of what this poem is about. My only question is this a snapshot of the attitude that most Americans or Confederates at that time had of warfare, that it was sort of this expression of youthful beauty? And did the attitude change later on in the war? Did we still have teenagers signing up to be mowed down and, in droves? I'm not sure this attitude persisted for that much longer.
That's good. That's a good point. October '61, that was pretty early in the war. You wonder if the troops leaving towns in 1864 were cheering their men, or whether they were, too traumatized by all the casualties that had already happened. So yeah, it gives a good idea about the initial sense of enthusiasm for sending these young men to go out and fight. So the war, I mean, the poem is about not just the war, but about.
But isn't that always how it is?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's about the impact of the war on Melville, or someone like Melville, who is, of course, he himself is living in Pittsfield. He's in the town of Pittsfield at this point. He's not on his farm at Arrowhead. He's rented a house in Pittsfield. So he's watching these departures of troops from the Berkshires, and following the progress of their engagements pretty closely.
All right. Well, why don't we
Move on to
on?
Shiloh?
Yes, please.
Okay, so Shiloh, we all know, is a April 1862 important battle in spring of 1862 in Tennessee. Shiloh was the name of the church and the tiny town that it was fought around. So it was part of some initial westward push into Tennessee that led to further progress for the Union, for later invasion into Mississippi, and then over to Mississippi River, and the attempt to strangle the South, encompass it with either with armies or navy. So Shiloh, here's the poem. Shiloh, a Requiem, April 1862. Skimming lightly, wheeling still, the swallows fly low over the field in clouded days. The forest field of Shiloh, over the field where April rain solaced the parched ones, stretched in pain, through the pause of night that followed the Sunday fight, around the church of Shiloh. The church so lone, the log-built one, that echoed to many a parting groan, and natural prayer of dying foemen mingled there, foemen at morn, but friends at eve. Fame or country least their care, what like a bullet can undeceive? But now they lie low, while over them the swallows skim, and all is hushed in Shiloh. So what I like about the poem is, it's a pastoral elegy, which is a form that that Whitman later made famous with his Lincoln elegy, When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloom. So this uses rural imagery to commemorate the deaths of these soldiers. It was one of the early high casualty battles of the war, for both Union and Confederate. It was kind of a costly Union victory. It wasn't really a great strategic advance, but it was very costly. So the idea is that he's looking at the battlefield afterwards. The swallows are flying around, imagery of the peace of nature that follows up the terrible, confusion and violence of the war. So the swallows are there after the battle, and of course the battle was famous because of the rain that came to alleviate the pain and suffering of the wounded who were spread out. There was a Sunday fight. The mention of the Sunday fight is ironic, of course, because the battle is around a church of Shiloh, right? Shiloh in the old in Hebrew means peace, and Shiloh is a place of peace. So the irony here is that this terrible battle takes place around a church named after something designating peace, and it's a fight on Sunday. So notice too that the mention of the word Shiloh is in the very middle of the poem. It's like the poem leads up to the mention of the name, and then after the mention of the name of the church, you talk about the fallen soldiers who are dragging themselves on the ground or lying there wounded and groaning. And at this point there is peace, but it's the peace of death. Their country or their loyalty doesn't matter at this point because they're just dying. Fame, it doesn't matter. The whole exercise and fighting is meaningless now that they're about to die. So the idea is that it's a sort of anti-war message here, that no matter how good your cause is, it's a terrible thing to fight wars to decide issues, because the people who are sacrificed are their lives are lost, and the cause for them loses meaning in their pain and suffering. So it's sort of an anti-war poem, but it's also sort of gently consoling for the, in the tone of the poem and the idea of the healing nature. I mean, the idea of pastoral elegy is that no matter how terrible death is, nature always comes back and restores things to the order of death and life and death and life. So there's sort of two counter currents in the poem of, you know, lamenting the sacrifice of these young lives and then looking to nature as sort of breeding some faint hint of regaining the balance to go on living.
Yeah, it's a hard poem to talk about. It's so beautiful. Part of me just like wants to let the silence after you finish it to speak for it. Um, what's interesting I'm noticing here is that there seems to be a measurable shift in tone within Melville, where you have almost this, I guess what we would call an anti-war selection here, but later on the poems become much more might is might is right or right is might patriotic. It makes me wonder about the construction of this text. If he changed his tune, if he had some sort of epiphany during the construction of this text.
Well, I just think he's reflecting the different moods of anyone who's on the sidelines as a civilian watching the war unfold, but also patriotic about the cause of the North. I mean, he had no doubt that the Union cause was just, but of course, on occasion, he's going to say this loss of life is terrible, and these young boys are, their eyes are open to the horrors of war when they are screaming, with these terrible wounds on the battlefield. Of course, we all know that the Civil War had a huge casualty rate because they were fighting with new kinds of weapons. There was a new Minet ball that would kind of explode when it entered your skin. It was a very potent bullet, and the rifles had much better accuracy than in the past. So, 650,000 casualties. I'm sorry, deaths from the war because of this technological advance that had taken place.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the biggest surprises to me. Although I don't know if they amassed as many casualties as I've gone deeper into the literature, finding out how many technological advances were made, like in the Navy. I didn't realize that we had that naval capacity back then of the Ironsides and the submersibles and torpedoes and things like that. I didn't think that stuff happened until much later, but it was a great period of acceleration in regards to that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you want to do the victory, Jim?
Yeah, let's do it. All right, it's longer one. Hopefully I won't fumble over it. Let's see. The Victor of Antietam, 1862. When tempest winnowed grain from bran,
when grain
and men were looked for a man, authority called you to the van. McClellan. Along the line the plot ran,
as later when Antietam's cheers began.
Through storm cloud and eclipse must move, each cause and man dear to the stars and Jove, nor always can the wisest tell.
Deferred fulfillment from the hopeless knell. The struggler
from the floundering
ne'er-do-well.
A pal on the 7 days fell. McClellan, unprosperously heroical. Who could Antietam's wreath foretell? Authority called you, then in mist,
and loom of jeopardy dismissed. But staring peril soon appalled, you the discarded she recalled you, nor endured delay.
And forth you rode upon a blasted way,
upon arrayed Pope's rout,
and routed his array.
McClellan, your tent was choked with captured flags that day.
McClellan, Antietam was a telling fray.
Recalled you, and she heard your drum,
advancing through the glassy gloom. You
manned the wall. You
propped the
propped the
dome.
dome.
You stormed the
stormed
powerful stormer home. McClellan.
McClellan.
Antietam's cannon
long shall boom.
At Alexandria, left alone. McClellan, your veterans sent from you and thrown to fields and fortunes all unknown. What thoughts were yours revealed to none, while faithful still you labored on. Hearing the far Manassas gun, McClellan, only Antietam could atone. You fought in the front an evil day, McClellan, the forefront of the first essay. The cause went sounding, groped its way. The leadsman quarreled in the bay. Quills thwarted swords, divided sway. The rebel flushed in his lusty May. You did your best as in you lay, McClellan. Antietam's sunburst sheds array. Your medaled soldiers love you well, McClellan. Name your name, their true hearts swell. With you they shook dread, Stonewall's spell. With you they braved the blended yell.
A rebel and maligner fell.
With you in shame or fame they dwell. McClellan, Antietam braves a brave can tell.
And when your comrades, now so few, McClellan,
such ravage
and deep files they rue,
meet round the board and sadly view the empty places tribute due. They render to the dead and you. Absent, silent
o'er the blue.
The one arm lift the wine to you, McClellan, and great Antietam's cheers renew. All right. So, what was so interesting to me about this poem is that the official understanding, or whatever the mainline understanding is of Antietam, seems to go against this memorializing of McClellan that Melville did. From what I understand about the Battle of Antietam, I mean, it was one of the worst battles of the Civil War. I think didn't the most people die on that day? I think the total was 22,717, and from what I understand, Antietam was, I guess, technically a Union victory, but because the South had to withdraw, but Lee, if I understand this correctly, like Lee pretty much fought it to a standstill, and McClellan only committed like 3/4 of his force, and if memory serves me correctly, didn't this sort of failure to more soundly beat Lee, didn't this lead to didn't this lead to Abraham Lincoln removing McClellan, right?
Yeah,
right?
He was eventually I mean, he was first taken away. I mean, he had led the Army of the Potomac in the initial effort in the spring of 1862 to invade Richmond. You know, and the thing about McClellan, though, he was loved by his troops. He was very glamorous, very disciplined, very polished. He went to West Point. But, you know, Lincoln hated him or disliked him because he was so conservative. He was always worried about not having enough men, and he wasn't willing to commit himself to battle like Grant. I mean, that was the big difference. Grant was willing to take risks, you know, calculated risks. McClellan wasn't. He thought he had to have all these supplies. He didn't want to risk any kind of defeat. So Lincoln eventually booted him from command, but then, you know, John Pope was in charge, and then Pope lost the second Manassas fight in the summer, and then so McClellan got reappointed to lead the battle that led the campaign that led to Antietam. So, you know, it's a tribute to McClellan as this ideal heroic Northern general who looked very glamorous on his horse and was very well spoken, and was loved by his men because he drilled them over and over, but he always stood up for them. He made sure they had the supplies they needed, and so it's sort of paying tribute to McClellan as someone who had sort of failed and then come back for a second act and won this important engagement, even though he didn't follow up on his victory as he should have, by pursuing the Confederates back across the Potomac, into Maryland and then Virginia.
Yeah, what was perplexing to me about this battle, from what I understand, is that McClellan thought that Lee actually outnumbered him, and that was part of the reason why he held back his troops. And I was like, how could he make that miscalculation? And then the second thing was that I guess this technical victory at Antietam gave Lincoln the cover to do the Emancipation Proclamation, which dissuaded England and France from recognizing the Confederacy, which is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the Antietam was the key battle where Lincoln was looking for an excuse, a sign that the Union was moving forward to be able to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, because, it was a very loaded decision, because a lot of the Northern soldiers thought they were fighting to restore the Union. They weren't fighting to liberate the slaves. So it took a certain political courage for Lincoln to begin the process of emancipation, and he did it after Antietam. And of course, McClellan was the guy who ran against Lincoln in 1864 as a Democrat, right? As someone who wanted to negotiate with the South to try to bring an end to the war before there was any decisive surrender. So, and Melville knew this when he published the poem. So that's why it shows a sort of guarded tribute to McClellan, because yes, he was a very respected Northern general, but on the other hand, he had disappointed Lincoln. He had disappointed the country to a certain extent.
I think it's so weird how history gets written, that we know more about losing commanders like Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, but a winning Northern commander. I mean, I don't think anyone could tell you very much about, the common person couldn't tell you very much about McClellan, let alone that he ran against Abraham Lincoln in 1864. I mean, it seems like he was a pretty impressive guy. And I guess maybe Melville knew that and wanted to resurrect his image with this poem.
Yeah, well, I think he had a fairly prosperous career after the war. He didn't really lose his reputation. As we said, his troops loved him, and that didn't really change.
Yeah. So it's more of a modern phenomenon that we've forgotten who McClellan is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a lot written about him as an important general in the early phases of the war. But he was an egotist. At one point Lincoln came over to talk to him, and he pretended like he was out. He wouldn't come downstairs to talk to Lincoln. So he stood him up, basically. So he was, he and Lincoln really didn't get along very well, and that was bad for the country.
Yeah, there's not this. I don't think there's this cult of McClellan like there is with other figures from the Civil War, which just strikes me as interesting about how that's ultimately decided. So there were some other things that I thought were interesting about this poem. I won't dwell. It's a long one, so I've taken up a lot of time. But what I thought was really interesting, and I don't mean it to be necessarily contradictory to what you said earlier about the ethical purity and the biblical notions that inspired Melville to write this. But we see, I start to notice, at least in the selections that I chose, there's this Astro theology going on here. Like in the stanza, though storm cloud and eclipse must move, each cause and man dear to the stars and Jove. Like he's, it's almost like we're dealing with astrology here and talking about how Jupiter directs the paths of men. I thought this was sort of interesting. It's something that we'll see come up, I believe, again in the discussion of Stonewall Jackson. But I was just kind of curious if you know of any flirtation that Melville may have had with astrology, because it seemed to jump out a little bit to me.
The temptation with what?
If he had any flirtation with astrology.
Yeah. Well, he's using astrological imagery here because it's traditional. I mean, in Shakespeare, great events are always, historical events are always indicated by heavenly derangements and activities, like in Julius Caesar, or after the death of Duncan in Macbeth. The stars are out of alignment and all these bizarre things are happening. Horses are going crazy and eating each other. This is a traditional motif that goes back to the Greeks and Romans. Roman history is filled with all kinds of allusions to cosmic events that supposedly are indicating the future. They had a whole college of augurs and people who were trying to figure out the future. So historically, it's appropriate because I don't think Melville was an astrologer by any means, but he recognized the importance of this kind of imagery in writing about world historical events like this.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point to make, that he's carrying on a literary tradition, which makes good sense here. There was one part of the poem that perplexed me, that I couldn't really figure out, and maybe you have some thoughts about it. But it's this stanza. You fought in the front, an evil day, McClellan, the forefront of the first essay. The cause went sounding, groped its way. The leadsman quarreled in the bay. Quills thwarted swords, divided sway. The rebel flushed in its lusty May. You did your best as in you lay, McClellan, and Tatum's sunburst sheds a ray. What is this quills thwarted swords?
Well, quills, in other words, people writing, the politicians and the journalists and the. So this is descriptive of his early career in the spring of 1862, leading this huge army down to try to capture Richmond early in the war to put an end, to the war quickly. And of course, that was stopped and led to some, terrible defeats and reverses. So, he was groping along because he was always worried about logistics and how many men he thought he was going to fight. The leadsmen quarreled in the bay. Well, they were coming in, going down the coastline of Virginia and coming in to, say, different places like in the Rappahannock River there. The coast of Virginia is marked by all these indentations and rivers and outlets, and the invasion, relied on a lot of equipment coming down by ship and then unloaded. So there was, describing the conflicts that led to his eventual decision to withdraw and to call off that campaign.
Nice. I see. Thank you for that clarification. Why don't you proceed with the next poem?
Okay, so we'll do Stonewall Jackson. The subtitle is "Mortally Wounded at Chancellorsville."
No.
I'm sorry.
It's your turn.
Yeah. I'm gonna read Stonewall Jackson, right?
Did we choose the same poem?
What?
Did we both choose the same poem? I think yours was The Housetop.
Oh well, I'm sorry. I'm doing it chronologically.
Okay. Sure. I can do.
I have Stonewall Jackson, and then Stonewall Jackson was tried to Virginia, and the Gettysburg. I just listed them chronologically.
Oh, okay. All right. Cool. Well, you can read it. Go ahead and read this one. You go ahead and read the one at Chancellorsville.
Stonewall Jackson, mortally wounded at Chancellorsville, May 1863. The man who fiercest charged in fight, whose sword and prayer were long, Stonewall, even him who stoutly stood for wrong. Can we praise? Yet coming days shall not forget him with this song. Dead is the man whose cause is dead. Vainly he died and set his seal, Stonewall. Earnest in error as we feel, true to the thing he deemed was due, true as John Brown or Steele. Relentlessly he routed us, but we relent, for he is low. Stonewall. Justly his fame we outlaw, so we drop a tear on the bold Virginian's bier, because no wreath we owe. So we remember Stonewall Jackson was killed by one of his own pickets when he was coming back from doing reconnaissance in May 1863, after the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was a Confederate victory. So the irony was that, just after the Confederates had won an important victory, they lost their most talented general to a freak accident of his being shot by one of his own pickets, and he was shot in the arm. Got infected, had to be amputated, and then he got pneumonia and died of his wounds.
He has a couple graves. I believe you can go visit his arm and you can go visit his body. Isn't that right?
What's that?
I think he has a couple graves. I think you can visit his arm and you can also visit where his body is laid to rest.
Well, of course, he was.
I think so.
He was a professor at the Virginia Military Academy, the VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, when he was decided to enlist. And he was famous for his religious zealotry, sort of a holy warrior, very religious, very devout, and also very outspoken about, fighting the Union. So I like the poem because it shows the fact that Melville is not neglecting some of the Confederate heroes of the war, but on the other hand, he's not going to celebrate their death as being heroes. He's going to try to be honest and say that the North, thought that he was fighting on the wrong side, obviously, but he was earnest in error, as we feel. So earnest meaning he was serious, he was dedicated, he was like John Brown in his zealotry for his cause.
I have so many questions about cause here. I wonder if you could elaborate on this while we're on the topic. Is that, like you were saying earlier, a lot of the Union troops that were participating in the war early on were fighting for the preservation of the Union, and then the Emancipation Proclamation came in and sort of injected this new moral dimension to it. Where is Melville in all of this? Is he just do his opinions change during the course of the war? Was he an abolitionist from the start? Was he a big Lincoln fan? How does it, because you got a bunch of different competing ideologies here. It doesn't seem like everyone who is a unionist is necessarily an abolitionist, and it doesn't seem that all unionists are necessarily, as seen with like McClellan, right, who didn't like Lincoln. Where does Melville fit in all this? Does he check all the boxes of being a Lincoln fan, a unionist, and an abolitionist? Do those happen throughout the war? Where does he fit?
Yeah, pretty much. Family were Democratic, so, but Melville was not outspoken in his political affiliation. I mean, he was a sort of loosely loyal Democrat. His brother, of course, had helped elect James Polk to the White House in 1844. But Melville was, he disliked slavery. He did not know much about it. The only experience he had of it was when he went down to Washington, D.C. in 1847. But he'd lived around, free blacks in New York and in Albany. His grandfather had owned slaves when it was legal in New York State. So, but he was a loyal Democrat during the war, and there were loyal Democrats who were committed to the cause of union, and some of them served in Lincoln's administration, like the Stanton Secretary of War was a Democrat, so Melville was firmly committed to the Union cause, and he was firmly committed to emancipation of blacks as well.
Right on.
Do you want to do the second Stonewall Jackson poem?
Yeah, I should. Here we go. Stonewall Jackson, ascribed to a Virginian. One man we claim of wrought renown, which not the North shall care to slur. A modern lived who sleeps in death, calm as the marble ancients are. 'Tis he whose life, though a vapor's wreath, was charged with the lightning's burning breath, Stonewall, stormer of the war. But who shall hymn the Roman heart, a stoic he, but even more, the iron will and lion thew, were strong to inflict as to endure. Who like him could stand or pursue? His fate the fatalist followed through, and all his great soul found to do, Stonewall followed his star. He followed his star on the Romney march, through the sleet to the wintry war, and he followed it on when he bowed the grain, the wind of the Shenandoah, at Gaines' Mill in the giant strain, on the fierce forced stride to Manassas Plain, where a sword with thunder was clothed again, Stonewall followed his star. His star he followed athwart the flood, to Potomac's northern shore, when midway waiting his host of braves, my Maryland, loud did roar. To red Antietam's field of graves, through mountain passes, woods, and waves, they followed their pagod with hymns and glades, for Stonewall followed a star. Back it led him to Mary Slope, where the shock and the fame he bore, and to green Mossneck it guided him, brief respite from throes of war. To the laurel glade by the wilderness grim, through climax victory naught shall dim, even unto death it piloted him, Stonewall followed his star. Its lead he followed in gentle ways, which never the valiant mar. A cap we sent him bestarred to replace the sun-scorched helm of war. A fillet he made of the shining lace, childhood's laughing brow to grace. Not his was a goldsmith's star. Oh, much of doubt and after days shall cling as now to the war. Of the right and the wrong they'll still debate, puzzled by Stonewall's star. Fortune went with the North elate, aye, but the South had Stonewall's weight, and he fell in the South's vain war. So, I mean, the biggest thing I thought that was interesting about this poem was is that it's ascribed to a Virginian. It's kind of, it seems like Melville wanted to properly acknowledge Stonewall, but he didn't want to actually sign his name to it, so he could sort of project it onto somebody else, and Stonewall could get his due. Do you think that's why he did that?
Well, yeah, it's quite unusual to have two consecutive poems devoted to this one general who was on the other side. But I think the first poem is short and is sort of a brief ambivalent elegy saying, we really suffered because of you, and we really can't give you much credit for what you were fighting for. You were misguided, but we'll drop a tear, but we're not going to put a wreath on your tomb. So we can be sad for your loss, but of course you are the enemy, so we can't really give you much credit. But the second poem is ascribed to a Virginian, so it's telling the history of Stonewall Jackson's career from the perspective of a fellow Southerner. So it's unusual for this collection in that Melville is giving a chance for the other side to speak. It's really the only example of that in the whole collection. But it follows his career pretty much from the beginning to the end during the war, and goes through lists some of his important battles. and it uses this motif of following his star. In other words, it was his following his destiny, and which of course led to his accidental death in 1863. So it's paying tribute more extensively than the first poem really could, which was pretty much about the manner of his death. This tragic, accidental death. And this is more sort of an overview of his career as a general.
How did this concept of destiny and following the star work within the mentality of someone like Stonewall Jackson or Melville as he tries to memorialize them? I mean, how did they understand destiny in this conflict?
I'm sorry, could you just say that again?
How, because you get these, something I noticed in these poems and in these accounts, like there are these nebulous concepts that are frequently thrown around: glory, honor, and destiny is one of them. This following a star and it's his destiny and da 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 da. What was the understanding of destiny that Melville and maybe Stonewall Jackson himself were working off of? Where did this idea come from? What is it?
It's interesting because both Stonewall Jackson was, Presbyterian. Melville grew up with a very strong Calvinist early immersion in the church from the Dutch Reformed Church, which was also very Calvinist. So, Presbyterians, Calvinists, they believe in the idea of predestination. And so there's a whole sense that, there is a control of the world by a superior God. And, of course, Melville was not devout like Stonewall Jackson, but he was haunted by the idea of fate and fatality based on his early immersion in Calvinist ideas of predestination. Everyone is fated to go to heaven or hell, so they're just living out the drama of their life, and they can't know where they're going to end up until their death, really.
No, I find it fascinating. As so much psychological analysis I would want to do of what people were thinking, especially when it's easier for me to understand if we take, we're using these Christian concepts, but it's so often mixed in with these pagan ones, as that Melville very much liked to do, again, with this seeming references to astrology, although we sort of cleared that up earlier, saying that was reference to an earlier tradition of Shakespearean and Greek literature. But even in one stanza, he says, they followed their pagod. And I had to look up what pagod was. And that's an idol.
Yeah, an idol. Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
it's a pagoda. Yeah, yeah. And
pagod. He was an idolized, right? So he became sort of a celebrity general, and they worshipped him like an idol.
Yeah. So it almost is like it's almost like he's trying to say that there was something cult-like going on with the South and these generals.
I mean, there still is. Stonewall Jackson is an idol of the South, and he's really gets almost as much attention as Lee.
Yeah. Well, I want to know what this cult is. I want to know what the larger mapping of the ideology of this cult is. There was one stanza that was sort of perplexing to me. Maybe you could clear up the stanza that reads, its lead he followed in gentle ways, which never the valiant mar. And these lines right here: a cap we sent him, bestarred to replace the sun-scorched helm of war. Do you know what that line is a reference to?
You're talking about the second to last stanza?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah.
A cap we sent him, bestarred to replace the sun-scorched helm of war. And I had an a fillet he made of the shining lace, childhood's laughing brow to grace. Not his was a goldsmith's star. I found this to be very enigmatic. I didn't understand it.
Well, a fillet he made of the shining lace. Well, lace, of course, shows his rank of general, right? So a fillet is a little string, right? It's a sort of a sort of like a head wreath you put around your head.
Right, right, right.
Um, so it shows that he doesn't take his rank too seriously. I mean, he's very no nonsense about wearing the glamorous signs of his high rank in the military, right? So we sent him to start to replace the Sunchco's helm of war. So um, he not his was a goldsmith's star, right? So he doesn't care for the accoutrements of high rank, right? He's all about the fight, and doesn't matter what he's wearing. Um, and so
Well, you can, yeah, that makes sense. I guess the only other thing I would say about this poem is at the very last stanza, he says, puzzled by Stonewall's star. Like, this doesn't fit. Stonewall Jackson doesn't fit into Melville's increasingly black and white categories of right and wrong in this conflict. He's wrong, right? He's ignorant of the justice of his cause, but the earnestness to which he committed creates some sort of paradox for the discussion about this particular individual, and I guess it's a microcosm of the conflict itself and why in some circles it's still debated. What do you think? What do you think the concepts were that Melville was really wrestling with there? I mean, if the South was so cult-like and so rebellious and I guess satanic, why does he have sympathy for Stonewall? It may be obvious, but
well, like a lot of people, he admired manliness, manly courage. And so the courageousness and the honorable behavior of this man. I mean, he's very aggressive, very deadly enemy, but on the other hand, he was a devout Christian, and he followed the rules, and he wasn't involved in any underhanded scandals or anything like that. So I think he's just paying tribute to the only person that he could really probably present. I mean, he has a poem about Lee later on, right? Lee in the Capitol, but it's the only other person that the North could grudgingly respect because he was such an outstanding general. And but of course the paradox was he was so religiously devout, but it was all in the cause of slavery and defending the Southern way of life, which was built on slavery.
Well, I think that does a nice segue for the next poem, which is it
Gettysburg, or do we have another one?
Yeah.
Would you like to read it?
Yeah, and I mean, because we're over about an hour, do you want to just end with this and then pick up with the next ones when we do our next?
Sure, that sounds fine. Let's do that.
Okay. All right, so I'll read Gettysburg. So the subtitle here, the title Gettysburg has a subtitle, The Check. It's dated July 1863. Of course, the battle was fought the first 3 days of July. O pride of the days and prime of the months, now trebled in great renown, when before the ark of our holy cause fell Dagon down, Dagon foredoomed, who armed and charged, never his impious heart enlarged beyond that hour. God walled his power, and there the last invader charged. He charged, and in that charge condensed his all of hate and all of fire, He sought to blast us in his scorn and wither us in his ire. Before him went the shriek of shells, aerial screamings, taunts, and yells. Then the three waves in flashed advance surged, but were met, and back they set. Pride was repelled by sterner pride, and right is a stronghold yet. Before our lines it seemed a beach, which wild September gales have strown with havoc on wreck, and dashed therewith pale crews unknown, men, arms, and steeds. The evening sun died on the face of each lifeless one, and died along the winding marge of fight and searching parties alone. Sloped on the hill the mounds were green, our center held that place of graves, and some still hold it in their swoon, and over these a glory waves. The warrior monument crashed in fight shall soar transfigured in loftier light, a meaning ampler bear. Soldier and priest with hymn and prayer have laid the stone, and every bone shall rest in honor there.
Nicely done.
So this is Melville's, poem to the important Battle of Gettysburg with 50,000 casualties combined on both sides.
Wow.
He begins with this interesting image from the Old Testament, from the first book of Samuel.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that.
The image of Dagon. Dagon, of course, was the Philistines', fish god, and supposedly the god, fell down when they brought the ark into the conquered territory. The idol fell over, as though this was a sign that the Philistine cause was finished. These were the battles of the between Hebrews and the native peoples of the area. So the idea is that just like the idol of the Philistines fell to pieces when the Ark of the Covenant was brought in. The Ark of the Covenant, of course, holds the Ten Commandments inside. It's this big chest that was carried around and was put into the temple. When they were moving around, they would build a tent around it, and then when they finally built the temple in Jerusalem, they put the Ark of the Covenant, behind the veil in the temple. So Melville is using Old Testament imagery here, which ties in with the idea that, like the South, the North thought of itself as a new Israel fighting a holy war against an enemy. In this case, here the Philistines. But he uses Old Testament imagery in a couple of key poems. One other important allusion is to the Exodus, the defeat of the Egyptians at the Red Sea. The passage over the Red Sea and the Song of Moses that was celebrating the defeat of the Egyptians. Well, here it's the defeat of the Philistines.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're elaborating on who Dagon was. My question is here is, does that make it plausible to infer that Melville is saying that Lee is Dagon? And if so, this is perplexing because, just earlier we were talking about how he was able to find some redeeming virtue in Stonewall Jackson.
Well, I think it's collective identification of the South as an unholy force invading the North. This was their big chance to try to defeat the North by invading Pennsylvania, and then if they had won, they would have gone down to Baltimore and Washington, and maybe caused a premature end to the war. So I think the idea is that this idol, these people with their idol of slavery, are, have this key defeat, and their idol is definitively knocked over, because it's all going to be downhill from this point on. I mean, there's going to be another year and a half of war, but this is the key moment when the South is never going to be able to recover to, it's going to be a slow strangulation of the South from this point on. And so there's also some other interesting imagery here where, the Confederates, the invader, he calls them, they charged, and in that charge condensed his all of hate and all of fire. He sought to blast us in his scorn and wither us in his ire. So it's this idea that this is some kind of fierce onslaught of hatred, So it sort of suggests the imagery of Paradise Lost, the rebel angels fighting against God's forces in Book 6 of Paradise Lost, because of this emphasis on anger and rage amongst these rebel soldiers. And, he's describing the 3 waves in flash advance. Well, that could describe the fact that it was a 3-day battle. And there was a constant, back and forth between the forces, a very complicated battle. When he talks about, in the last stanza, he talks about, sloped on the hill the mounds were green, our center held that place of graves, and some still hold it in their swoon, and over these glory waves. So at the top of the so-called fish hook at Gettysburg was something called Cemetery Hill, which is just south of the town of Gettysburg, and then below that runs Cemetery Ridge. And Cemetery Hill is called that because it had what was called the Evergreen Cemetery on it, which was the town cemetery that was built in the 1850s. And so, there was a Union group of Union soldiers who were defending that. Actually, General Howard had his artillery positioned on that hill, and a lot of the men used the gravestones to hide from fire, and they knocked them down and during the battle. So the graveyard there was chewed up because it was at the center of a lot of fighting. And what Melville is saying in the last stanza is that he wrote a note to this stanza saying he's specifically referring to the grave of a northern soldier who was buried there earlier, a year earlier, from the Peninsular Campaign, with McClellan, and his grave was knocked over. This is a very obscure event in a very large battle, and what Melville is saying, that his warrior monument, even though it was knocked over during the battle, is going to be restored transfigured in loftier light. It's going to rise up again, alluding to the fact that they had just reburied all the dead from Gettysburg in the new cemetery that Lincoln, of course, commemorated with his Gettysburg Address on November 19th, 1863. But Melville actually is referring not to the dedication of that cemetery in November 1863, but the dedication of the cornerstone to a new monument that rose above the cemetery. That was the cornerstone was laid on July 4th, 1865. So he refers in the final stanza to the consecration of the cemetery when the cornerstone of this huge monument, this 60-foot monument with a statue of freedom on the top that sits above the graveyard, which is right next to Cemetery Hill, so all the Union dead have their honorable interment, and they have their monument, rising above them. So it's if you go to Gettysburg, it's a very elaborate place of monuments and graveyards. So he's sort of consecrating, saying, these dead are honored by having monuments which are, have this sort of sacred quality to them. And of course, this was a time when the Gettysburg Address was not nearly as it wasn't really recognized as a classic speech. It was just it took a long time for that speech to sort of be recognized as a classic event during the war, and then a classic statement of Civil War principles to the North.
Oh man, I would just love to pick apart the Gettysburg Address one day. Well, man, I really enjoyed our session, Dr. Cook. I know it went long. I know that we maybe bit off a little bit more than we could chew, but I mean, I just think that demonstrates just how rewarding it is to interrogate and investigate the poetry. And, personally, I'd like to keep at it. And I hope everybody enjoyed the discussion today, and we'll have more for you.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. You can download the Noetic app and check this particular discussion on YouTube, SoundCloud, and at noetic.online. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.